All right, so we are in our Images of God series. This is our last week of it. We've had 5 weeks where we started with I am who I am, went into God, our Father and Mother, then our Rock and Redeemer, then talked about clothing last week and the lack thereof in some of those examples. And today we get to talk about God as bread and vine. And then, like I said, next week, no word for women. All right. So one of the things that when we come to images of God, I start with this because it's good to remember that metaphors are helpful things. How we approach God and with what metaphors we use is important. They help us make sense of our experiences of the world and the mystery of the divine. I mean, the what? Oh, sorry. I thought that was to me. All right. And so it helps us to make sense of this mystery that is kind of something that we can't really fully make sense of. I mean, if you remember the first week, I talked about how God is the mystery that nobody wants because we like knowing for sure. We like knowing facts. We like having concrete examples. So these various metaphors we've been offering are ways to engage God in those ways. So if we think back to the parent week, some of the pieces of God's identity that come up when we think of God as a parent include trust and relationship. And we talked a lot about that the first week. With the rock, we talked a lot about how the rocks provide protection and strength and seeing God as that and talking about Rock of Ages. Last week we talked about clothing, and the clothing gives us comfort and helps us talk about our identity in some ways. And so all of these things can lead us to a deeper sense of who God is and how God is at work in our lives. Have there been any that have surprised you in the last couple of weeks? No? That's okay. This is a limited so we're not going through all of the metaphors for God in the Bible because, we'd be here forever if we did that. But we just highlighted some of the more common ones. And arguably, the one we have for today is, so God as bread and wine, is arguably one of the most common images that we have for God. Probably second only to God as parent, because it shows up in our worship services regularly. I mean, parent shows up in when we pray the Lord's Prayer and we say, God, our Father who art in heaven. And bread and wine, where does that show up? Communion, it does. So it's fun to explore kind of what this can mean for how we approach God. And now, before we get too deep into the weeds on this, I want to ask a playful question. So enter this with a spirit of playfulness. What kind of bread do you think Jesus would be? Let's take a minute to think about it. What kind of bread do you think Jesus would be? At least for you. What was that, Diane? Artesian bread. Ooh, you want Jesus to be artesian bread?
Whole wheat.
Yeah. Holy bread. Aha. Oh, holes in it. Nice. Well done.
Whole wheat.
Whole wheat bread. Yeah, whole wheat bread would be fun. Self-rising bread. I love it. That was a great one. Rye bread. Rye bread, do you spell it with a W? Oh, it's rye. Huh, nice. Spell it with a W. What was that? Everything bread. I do love a good everything bagel. They're so good. I'm surprised there aren't any sweet options coming up yet. Like, what about like a chocolate croissant? I mean, Jesus could be a chocolate croissant, right? If we're gonna play with metaphors here, let's make this interesting. Any other ones?
I was thinking sourdough, not that I think Jesus is sour, but it's like the quintessential loaf of bread.
The sourdough bread, and not because Jesus is sour, but because it's a quintessential loaf of bread. Yeah. And Jesus feels a little quintessential sometimes, right? Yeah. Yeah, Cindy. Unleavened bread. You'd want Jesus to be unleavened bread? Well, because of where he lived in the time, but I don't know if I like eating unleavened bread. I've eaten a lot of unleavened bread this week. We've been teaching the first communion class. That's a great answer. I mean, there's a lot of options. Anyone else? Yeah, Donna. Banana chocolate chip. That's a good one. Any particular reason why?
Well, because it has chocolate.
Has chocolate in it? I was going to say, can you add the walnuts and say he's a little bit nutty? I know, then walnuts, yeah. Phil, thanks for playing with this question. What I love about it is that, bread on a very basic level for those who can eat it, because I know there are people who are gluten-free, or you make the gluten-free bread so that way you can eat it. It's one of the things that fills our basic needs. I mean, everybody needs to eat to live. And if God is bread, then God meets my needs, can be one of the ways we look at it. However, if we add some of these characters and this playfulness to it, then maybe if God is my peanut butter toast with jam, then God is also not just about my needs, but also is about protein and delight and sustenance. And so it's kind of fun to think about what these metaphors can do for us and how we experience God. So moving forward, the Bible and food. Food shows up everywhere in the Bible. In fact, it's one of the first ways that God shows humanity that God wants to be in a relationship with us. I mean, going back to Adam and Eve in that garden, God provides for their needs, saying, okay, I've created you. Here, live in this garden. You can eat of all of the food except for that one tree. And we know how this goes. We've talked about this story a few times a little bit in different ways. It's interesting how everything kind of comes back to that story, right? But food is one of the first ways that God intends to provide for humanity, and it is also the shorthand for disobedience. I mean, you can't talk about the Garden of Eden without talking about eating the forbidden fruit. They kind of go hand in hand. Moving forward in the Bible, then the Bible also tells humans what to eat, how to eat, where to eat it, when to eat, all these different things. It can almost be like a culinary guide to meals as part of the Bible. And I think it gets to that point that food meets our basic necessities. People cannot escape food. We need to have nutrients in our body, however we take them in to live. Food also becomes an element of hospitality, too. I think back when we had our first kid, and it was in those first weeks of having a newborn, and my neighbor texted me saying, I'd like to bring you dinner tonight. Do you like tacos? What time would you like it? And that was like the biggest gift of relief. Thinking, gosh, and, solidified the fact that, she was the best neighbor ever, and I have only warm, good thoughts towards her. I mean, so, sharing meals in times of need. Also, when you're going to catch up with an old friend or family members, what's the first thing you do? You eat. You go to coffee. You have a potluck. I mean, depending on the size of the event, food brings people together. And then one of the first stories, it's a symbol of hospitality, and it also carries memory. So like I said, with that neighbor who brought us tacos, every time I have tacos now, I think of her because it was just such a gift. She even left it at the doorstep, too, so I didn't have to talk to anybody, which first weeks of having a newborn, it was a big deal. But one of the early stories of God providing food is also found in the Exodus. So if you remember the story of the Exodus, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt. And it's not great. I mean, being enslaved is not great. Pharaoh is making them work hard, making them build pyramids, not giving them a decent life and treating them more like property than people. So God calls Moses to help lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread." They're misremembering. "For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it'll be twice as much as they gather on other days. So what do you hear in this story? What do you experience here? Testing. You hear the testing part. Yeah. So they're complaining. They're misremembering the past of being in Egypt. They do not have their fill of bread necessarily always. And they're saying, you're sending us out here to kill us with hunger. Well. And God's saying, okay, fine. I will provide for what you need, but I'm going to give you only enough for each day. And in that way, it's a test to say if they start to hoard the food longer than a day, if they want to start to squirrel it away to take care of themselves, God's going to know. So yeah, there's a little bit of a testing here because it kind of goes hand in hand with the God provides, and also humans kind of want to provide for themselves. I mean, we saw it in the Garden of Eden as well. What else do you guys hear in the story? Or ladies? Trust. Yeah. Hope. Yeah, God's providing. Yeah, Lois.
I have a silly, curious question.
Yeah.
How did he deliver? How was it?
So the manna would rain down. So basically it would show up. If you read further into Exodus, it kind of sounds like it shows up like the morning dew.
Because he says when they prepare what they bring in.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
There was some preparation.
There was some preparation. I mean, but with most breads, there is some preparation because I don't eat bread just plain, do you? I mean, there's probably something to help make the bread come together with something else as part of it. So if I'm putting this in on my shoes, I would prepare bread with peanut butter and jam and that kind of stuff. They didn't have that. I'm not saying they did, but there was some preparation with they would bring the bread in, and we don't live on just bread alone. We also need protein and fats and it's the carbs. As humans, we kind of need that because if you just ate bread the whole time, going to the bathroom might be really tough.
So he was telling them, go out and you'll find it.
Yeah, go out and you'll find it, essentially. And the preparing it is okay, how are you going to prepare this to enjoy it, to want to eat it?
So quit sitting, whining, and complaining.
Quit.
Go out and you'll find it.
Yeah, quit sitting, whining, and complaining. You'll find it. And in Exodus, it says it kind of right now, the morning dew, it shows up. There is some of the rabbis talk about how it might have tasted like coriander seed, and it says it was white, or it tasted like wafers with honey, or cake baked with oil. That's kind of what it tastes like. One of the things the others also said is that manna tasted like whatever the Israelites wanted it to taste like. Now, that isn't biblical. That's a way to read the story to help tell the story. They say that being it's God providing. It's God saying, okay, stop complaining and go out there and find the food, and it will be good. I'm not going to leave you high and dry. I'm not going to leave you out in the wilderness to die of hunger. So I hand back here.
I was just going to say
God's grace and provision. Yeah, exactly. God's grace and provision provided what they needed. That even as they were really whiny, because, you heard me read it really whiny. That's how I interpret this one. But God's grace and provision is really what matters in this story. Absolutely. So I hope that answered the questions. There's a big difference between need and want. Yeah. When they think back about Egypt, they were dying in Egypt. And they have a misremembered past because they are so angry and hungry, and it's coming out sideways. Yeah. And this testing with the obedience and disobedience, so God is testing them, but do you think they pass the test? They don't pass the test. If we were to read on further, they start squirreling it away. And once they do, the next day when more manna rains from heaven, then what they've squirreled away is full of maggots and bugs, and they can't eat it. So like that's how God's saying, like, I'm going to test them this way, and actually follows through with that. And like, nobody wants rotten food in their house. And so God's testing and humans also don't obey. It's this cycle that keeps showing up over and over again if you keep reading the Bible. I don't think it's because and this is where it gets tricky too, because we talk about that as humans being disobedient. And it very quickly falls into this trap of beating ourselves up that we can never be good enough for God, right? We could get stuck in this narrative of being like, gosh, I will never be good enough. This is awful. This is terrible. One of the ways that I reframe this is that part of this disobedience, that especially from these early stories, is this human desire for control and for wanting to be God. So part of that disobedience is because we want to be God. And when I reframe it that way, I can think, gosh, you know what? I'm trying to be God right now. I'm trying to control what I'm doing. I'm trying to like squirrel away my food, what have you. And then I can take a step back and go, okay, maybe I need to trust that God will provide. Maybe I need to take that step back to realize that God already does these things. And then it can change the perspective on this. So that's why these metaphors are important, because otherwise we get so caught into specific images that we forget about the wider mystery around God. All right, here, we're only like 3 slides in. What am I doing? So talking about provision, God provides for our needs. It's a God who provides for what we need, not necessarily more nor less. And it's not just humans that God tends to. I mean, there are stories where God feeds the ravens, and what more are we to God than them? Much of Jesus' ministry is also centered around food. Jesus' very first miracle in his ministry is turning the water into wine at the wedding in Cana. Not because he needed really good wine, but because of that hospitality piece, because God was providing so that way this family wouldn't be embarrassed, and ended up being this huge blessing. Jesus also, took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed 5,000 people with it. A lot of Jesus' ministry centers around food, which also leads us to, in kind of giving this notion that God fills the hungry with good things, and also leads us to John 6. So they, the disciples, said to Jesus, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you?" In other words, how do we know that you're God? How do we know? What do we need to do? What sign is there? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." What do you hear here? What do you experience? We have some connections between that wilderness wanderings and God providing the manna, and with Jesus' teachings. Do you think there's a little misremembered past here too? Where do you think that is?
They're giving credit to Moses for the bread.
They're giving credit to Moses for the bread. So the ancient Israelites whined and complained, and God gave the bread, and now the disciples are whining and complaining, and Jesus is saying, it wasn't Moses, it was God. Remember, God is here. God is providing still. And taking it a step further even. It's not only that God is providing, but Jesus himself is God. What do you hear? What else? Yeah, Cindy.
What would you tell someone who was hungry and thirsty and read this?
What would you tell someone who was hungry and thirsty who read this? That is a great question, which is one of the, I think that's what makes this text powerful. Because if somebody who is hungry and thirsty and reads this and also gets a meal, God providing is everything. I mean, I haven't been hungry and thirsty for longer than, a day or so from fasting at some point or just forgetting things. So I don't know what true hunger feels like. But to somebody who knows true hunger, who gets fed and hears this, God could be everything to them. That also leads us to, it'll lead us to the next section, Cindy, too. That if Jesus says, I am the bread of life, and what do we do with the bread of life? We take and remember him every time we eat and drink of it. That means it should equip us, too, when we see our hungry neighbors. Find ways to get them food, whether it's food for that meal or helping to change systems that are preventing meals, what have you. Hunger is a huge issue. And there are multiple ways to address it in our different capacities. And that it is part of our faithfulness to do so on behalf of our neighbor. I mean, just like my neighbor brought me tacos, it's also my job to move that forward as well. Does that help answer your question? It's a great question. Yeah. What else do you hear in this story? I hear also that human desire, too, to want to be God, to want to have control, to want to know what to do. That's very real here, too. So Jesus says, it's not about what you do, it's about who I am, and receiving that like a gift. And when you receive something as a gift, the usefulness of that gift depends on you to use it. In the Gospel of John, Jesus uses the phrase, I am, 7 times. I believe it was 7 times. This is 7 or 6, sorry. 7, that's 7. This is the first of Jesus' 7 I am statements. Now, what did we talk about the first week of what God calls God's self? I am who I am. This is Jesus connecting himself to God. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. This is pulling it all together. I also wonder in this, do you think that God likes feeding humans? Like not just doing it out of duty, but to enjoys it. I think so. I think God enjoys providing for humans. And maybe God gets something out of it too, that it makes God feel good to give us food and then see what happens when we go and give that food to others. Or how we respond when we are fed and nourished. And how it changes how we act as well. And how we feel when we give to someone else. Yeah, exactly. We don't give to someone else because we have to. We give to someone else because we have our fill and therefore can live in that place of knowing that we're provided for and that we can help provide others the same things. Yeah. I also think it's really interesting the history of white bread in general. It's a story of cultural nuances. So white bread in how it was created is kind of layered. Back in the 1800s, white bread was seen as something that only the wealthy got because having the bleached flour was a rare commodity. It was something that not many people had. And so in 1890, 90% of bread was baked by women in their homes. It didn't necessarily have the bleached flour effect to it. And now knowing more about food science and all of those details, and with advances that happened in the early 1900s, there was also the ability to, I think it was where is this? The technological advancements in microbiology, cereal chemistry, climate control, and industrial design reshaped people's daily bread. So by 1930, because the roller millstone the invention of the roller millstone, white flour became widely acceptable in the early 19th century and made it a fraction of the cost from what it was previously. So by 1930, 90% of bread moved out of the homes and was baked by men in distant factories and shipped around. It doesn't seem like much today, but the cultural nuances that come with it, specifically the emphasis on having white bread and what that means culturally, and also the fact that it was previously viewed as women's work and then became industrialized. Bread itself has a long history of shame, essentially, which is kind of interesting. It's an interesting twist to this story because it's a subtle shaming that happens. And, oh gosh, where am I at with that one? And it also created a cultural symbol as well in those early days, because then they also talked about how in that time period, whitewashing everything between clothing, appliances, and all of that stuff was also part of the general culture as well. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? I'm not going far enough into this, but how we talk about our daily bread can be shaped by some of these industrial revolutions, and also how we have processed and internalized that information. And understanding that will help lead us to having viewpoints that are similar or different to it. I also think it's interesting in how, as humans, we also idolize and demonize food. Now I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit, but I think this is really important because food becomes a polarizing subject at times. I mean, I'm standing in a room full of women who have probably said the word diet at one point in time or another. I know I have. And oftentimes when people want to diet to become the better part of themselves, the first things that go are carbs, aka bread, and also alcohol, the wine, which we'll get to in just a minute. So it's interesting that these things that are so close to the nature of God are the first things that we want to get rid of. And even, even more with that, the shame that comes with dieting and diet culture, and that can be, it can, I'm losing my words here because I think it's kind of a touchy subject, in all honesty. When going back to being pregnant, I had gestational diabetes with my first child, and it wasn't advanced enough to need insulin or medication, but just enough to have to manage through diet and exercise. Try telling a pregnant woman she can't have ice cream in the middle of summer. It sucked. It was terrible because not only that, and because of the ways in which that where appointments landed, I didn't quite know, and Google was not my friend. Living on a no-carb diet for a month while pregnant was not fun by any means. So those who have there are diet restrictions for health benefits. I mean, there are reasons to do it. And also, it's really difficult. And when we talk about God as food, like how do we process all of these complex views of food, especially if food is a metaphor for God? I'll tell you, in that season, God was not bread for me that season. I couldn't view that because otherwise I'd be very angry at God. So thankfully we have other metaphors for that as well. All right, I'm running out of time, darn it. All right, I also want to get to the vineyard because we said God is bread and vine and Holy Communion. That is where we most commonly experience this metaphor. So the prophets in the Hebrew Bible envisioned Israel as a vine or collection of vines. And God is the vineyard owner and the one who tends the vines. Jesus proclaims himself to be the vines and the people are the branches. This image of the vineyard includes both love and care and also judgment and fragility. I mean, to be a vine on a branch means you're exposed to the elements. Means vines and branches can wither and die. And the vineyards teach us about what it means to be human, to rely on God to provide. It also says something really profound about the incarnation when we bring this to Jesus. So Jesus is God who is also fully human. It shares an image of a God who will be with the people, even in their most endangered moments. weathering the elements together. And even when humans produce bad fruit and feel like they are the farthest from God's pleasure, Jesus has already been in that place. Jesus is already there because Jesus was human with us. So that leads us to the last Bible verse I have for today. It's from 1 Corinthians. And now this was the early church trying to make sense of like their rhythms and routines as a faith community and figuring out what is important to them and how they are going to practice their faith. And so the Apostle Paul writes, I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is not a sharing in the blood of Christ. The bread that we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. He's reflecting here on Jesus' Last Supper with the disciples. You know, take this bread, eat, do this in remembrance of me. Take this cup. This is the promise of the forgiveness of sins. Do this for the remembrance of me. And Paul is saying that because there is this one bread that Jesus gives us, and there is the one cup that we share, that we all can become unified. Getting to Cindy's point about how do we care for our neighbors? I mean, if we talk about if we see somebody who is hungry, then we should feel called to go out and help them, bringing us all together as one. It's a startling and graphic image, especially for those who would have been in the early church. I mean, we talk about it pretty commonplace when we share the words of institution in church, because we say, okay, Jesus' body and blood. I'll tell you, though, after leading First Communion, I think we had 6 rotations. There was roughly 140 kids who went through First Communion this time around. And every time some kid goes, why are we eating somebody's body? Why are we drinking somebody's blood? It's that very literal, visceral reaction to it, because it feels weird. And even the early Christian church, I mean, if we talk about the martyrdom that happened and the early Christians who were persecuted, one of the reasons why was because they talked about, well, this is Jesus' body, this is Jesus' blood, this is how we practice our faith. And those who were not part of the community go, so they're cannibals. Let's get them out of here. It's a very real thing to hold on to. And holding it as a metaphor is important and not literal body and blood. So, any questions about this text? All right. Don't worry, I don't have any more. I've got one left. I got 2 left. So we got a little bit of time. All right. Well, it does lead us to Holy Communion. Here's that sourdough, Pam. What I find beautiful about Holy Communion and sharing the words of institution, remembering Jesus' body and blood together, is that God becomes known through these everyday items. That if bread is something that people need to live, I mean, and bread being the metaphor for eating and for the food that we receive from God and the body and blood and all that, Jesus took the things that were on their table already. Jesus didn't say, hey, look, here's this fine caviar. Why don't you have this? You know, whenever you eat this, think of me. Because that limits its access. I mean, if caviar is one of those expensive things, or, like that Wagyu steak that's so expensive, Jesus didn't take those items. Jesus took the elements already there, already present. And so maybe if somebody couldn't eat bread, maybe Jesus would have taken something that was, gluten-free, or rice, or unleavened bread, or what have you, or not unleavened bread, but what have you, something that would have been available for the people to eat. Because that's what God wanted to do, was to provide for people. And Jesus was doing it in a new way. And Holy Communion is not about having the full meal together. That's also a question I get from our First Communion kids, is like why are we getting this little piece of styrofoam? It doesn't taste good. That's not the point. The point of this is to have God's body as near to us as being in our bodies. if we're going to talk about being Christ's hands and feet in the world, if we're going to talk about going out and sharing the love of God, then God's body needs to be in our bodies, giving us nutrients and sustaining us for the day. And so this little taste helps us to remember that. Was my phrasing funny? It's kind of a weird statement to say that we need God's body in our body. It's a very weird way to phrase it, but it's thought-provoking, isn't it? Like, we need God to be our sustenance. And when God's body enters our body, it doesn't let us stay the same. If we really think about it and really take it seriously, then can we ignore our hungry neighbors? Can we ignore our neighbors in need? Just interesting things to think about. And it's also a symbol of God's abundance. You know, God abundantly provides. God's been doing it since the very beginning of time. And when we remember God's abundance through something small, we begin to retool our understandings of what's necessary for life. So the Wagyu steak isn't as necessary as, not yelling at people out of hungry anger. And so we begin to shape what those understandings are. Any questions on these? Also, I want to point out that when we talked about what kind of bread would Jesus be, nobody said the communion wafers. Just throwing that one out there. For our last slide today, all of these images lead towards what are called quotidian mysteries. It's a very fun, big word. Quotidian means ordinary or mundane. These are all ordinary images. They oftentimes, when it comes to faith and being the humans who want to do what is right and think what is right and have all the answers, we tend to want God to be up here. We want God to be this thing we reach towards but never fully grasp, but want to really grasp. And by using these metaphors, each and every one of them, whether one sticks more than others for you, they're ordinary. They're everyday. I mean, you need food to live. We can see rocks right outside us. They're right next to us. We're all wearing clothing. Again, thank you. Parents, we have those relationships. So each and every one of these images helps connect us to God in very real and tangible ways. So how does it feel to experience God in the ordinary and the mundane? It's not where our brain first goes when we hear the word God. We don't normally put God and ordinary in the same category. But what would happen if we did? And maybe that's where we get those small miracles, those small blessings. Where's Bonnie with her rock that she brought in last week? Is she here? No, there you are, Bonnie. Seeing a rock and going, gosh, I see the cross of Christ and it led to a place of faith. I mean, just really beautiful things like that. That this transcendent God who feels so far away can meet us in our most intimate moments. And so I hope that's what you take away from this lesson, is just the ways in which God can be present to us and we can have these honest conversations about who God is and how God acts in our lives. All right, and before I send you off to small group, I do have one more poem for you today. This is our last one from Cynthia Ryland called God Made Spaghetti. And she didn't have a ceiling, so she tried to make it stick to Jupiter. But that just vaporized the noodle. So God decided to have faith it was cooked al dente. She filled up a big bowl and got herself a piece of sourdough and a copy of the New Yorker, and God had supper. And she would actually have liked somebody to talk to. She didn't like eating alone. But most people think God lives on air. Apparently, they've not noticed all the food she's created. So nobody ever invites her over, unless it's communion. And that's always a letdown. God's gotten used to one plate at the table. She lights a candle anyways. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.